Hi, hi everyone. Thanks for being here.
That clicker on the podium should work too if you want to use it.
Great. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah Rose, for the invitation. Thank you for that great introduction too. Yeah. So my name is Claire Alexander. I use she/they pronouns, and yeah, I identify as a diaspora child, abolitionist, feminist storyteller, student of ecologies. And my main medium is paint. I do murals, street art, studio work as well, and yeah, I'm just excited to be here today. So thank you. So I just want to dedicate this talk, this conversation, this space to my father, who passed away 11 months ago. And he was also an artist. He was a photographer, and photography was actually my first art form when I was a student in college before I transitioned to painting. So yeah, I just want to honor his memory and his legacy. So whenever I give talks, I always start with these two pieces and kind of give you a little bit of a story of how I started painting. So these two pieces I did in 2018 when I graduated college. So I grew up in France. My father is from the French Antilles, and I grew up outside. I grew up in the southeast part of France, and I was a total like nature kid, always outside, always like naked in the trees. Like it made total sense in my mind to pursue a career in the sciences because I loved just being outside and I loved nature, and so. Throughout high school, I kind of went the route of more environmental science, and then I got to college in 2014. I moved to the U.S. I went to Duke University to study environmental science, but I was not very good at it. I was actually quite bad, and I just can't. It's very hard for me to wrap my head around like just hard sciences, math. Physics, chemistry, it's just not meant for me. But I kept growing frustrated year by year, just being like, if I love nature so much and I want to join this field that is dedicated to protecting nature, why am I not good? Why am I not good enough in the classroom? And it was my senior year that I really stopped questioning like, why am I not good enough, and started kind of looking at who is telling me that I'm not good enough and what are these structures that exist within academia? And it was to no surprise that all of my professors, except one, were white. I only had two teachers who were non-male. And I just kept, my senior year, I just remember I kept like seeing the same text over and over by the same conservationist, preservationist. And we never really studied any indigenous texts. We never studied any texts from black folks. And so I was just like, oh, like, this field was just like not meant for me. It wasn't built for me. And I remember feeling very frustrated with like the repeated need from my field to be objective and to be like distant from things that brought me so much joy. And to me that didn't make a ton of sense. But anyways, so I left school. I bought a one-way ticket to Brazil. Didn't have a plan, but I was just like, I'm getting out of here. And that's when I started painting, really. I was staying with a friend's mom who had a studio in Sao Paulo. And at the time, I was mostly taking pictures. So I wanted to just have maybe a photo show. And 2 weeks into my trip, my camera breaks. And I didn't have a ton of money, so I still wanted to create something. And my friend was like, well, there's canvas, there's paint, just try it out. And I did, and this is the result of those first two pieces. So yeah, I just kind of like to tell that story because it just feels like a big moment in my life as a young person, kind of like processing all of this rage and misunderstanding and confusion and kind of channeling it into art, into something that feels a lot more accessible than what I was kind of like gearing towards doing in school. And Diego and I were actually kind of talking about this, of just the frustration of environmental science sometimes that that prides itself on basically being like a field that includes everybody, and doing work that is so important. But I ask myself this question of, if it's so important, how come it's so hard to access this information? How come a lot of times these journals are behind a paywall? How come a lot of times, even just reading the abstract, like by the third line I'm confused, like what are we actually talking about? And we were also talking about this with Diego, of like, we have enough information and data to know things are not okay. So how do we actually kind of change the narrative, and how do we actually start sharing stories, and and kind of divest a little bit from this extractive nature of, okay, we like trying to get to the bottom of this, and so that was kind of the product of all these different feelings. And specifically when I was in Brazil, I was learning about Quilombo communities, which are it's the word for maroon communities in Brazil. And I remember reading about how folks who, escaped plantation, how they were basically using local floras to build communities outside of the colonial system, which to me is so crazy, because we had never learned anything like that in school. Every time, Black folks were kind of brought into the narrative, it was as like case studies of like non-sustainable living, or like it was always something that had to be fixed. And I didn't really, all of those years when I was in school, I didn't ever really think of like, actually there are ways historically that Black people especially, our freedom is intertwined with understanding how to develop a symbiosis with plants. And that's what really kind of guided these first pieces. And ever since then, I never really stopped kind of sharing these stories, and and using my hands and using colors to kind of to highlight the ways in which like people and places and landscape actually are all intertwined. It's not nature versus culture. That's never been true, and it was just kind of like another way to extract and conquer and divide. So I'll move to the next slide. So after I started painting, I very quickly was kind of launched into doing murals, which was super, super exciting. So I was in Brazil for 3 months, and then I was in Colombia for 3 months, in Ecuador for 3 months, in Morocco for a little bit. So just moving around and like learning how to be in community and using art to kind of create spaces of color that were welcoming, that that allowed to kind of like bridge different barriers between communities. And so I was doing that for about 2 years, and then the pandemic hit, and I came back to Durham. So my mom is now in Durham, and I remember coming back here with a lot of distress, feeling like I wasn't really sure what was going to happen or where I was going to end up. So I started just working on a farm. That was the easiest thing at the time for me to do. And as I kind of shared in my bio, like a lot of this work is autobiographical. So the things that were happening, in my life at that time, kind of ended up like back in a painting. So I was doing a lot of farming, and that kind of translated into this piece, which is, it's painted on wood. It's like an 8x4 piece, and I painted that in October of 2020, and it was commissioned by the Farmer Food Share that's on Gear Street. So you can kind of see a little bit of the different elements that I was tending, the fruits and vegetables, and the buildings at the back. The one on the left is from Parish Street, which back in the day was called Black Wall Street, and then the one on the right is a house of a community elder that I kind of consider like my mom here in Durham, called Vanessa Evans. And so I was also doing a ton of reading and organizing. So as I was moving around after I graduated, I was learning a lot of things, but I remember feeling like not very rooted in place. And I felt like I was needing to kind of understand, like, well, I definitely wanted to be more politically active, and also just I felt the need to kind of put down roots somewhere. So I was doing a lot of reading. There's an Alexis Pauline Gumbs piece, Adrienne Marie Brown piece, and just some other pictures of different moments in time that I was organizing. And that kind of led, I mean, that always impacts my work, but like I just wanted to share these two pieces. So on the right, that's Danielle Purifoy, who is part of Durham Beyond Policing, who has been a mentor of mine for a long time. And on the left is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is a Black feminist intellectual, was a writer, a scholar, and was also a friend of mine. And yeah, so as you can kind of see, like there's the recurrence of portraits. Like it feels really important to me to not just focus on the plants, on the fauna, because our story is so intertwined with each other. And so, yeah, that is those two pieces. And then in the questions, I'm happy to kind of like talk a little bit more specifically about pieces if you have any questions. And then finally, I was, at that time in 2020, just kind of, as I was explaining before, started to kind of put down roots and like understand where I am. I was making medicine, moving a lot more slowly. And that kind of impacted and resulted in this piece, which is a mural that I did in Raleigh, downtown, for their Art Beats Festival. And yeah, it's honoring the 8 different federally recognized tribes of North Carolina. And I was doing kind of like different researches on plants that play an important part in different cosmologies and within different communities. And it felt really exciting to do that piece that's like right downtown Raleigh, like right in front of like a huge maybe not skyscraper, but like a big building. And yeah, and just I really, murals and public art in this way feel really important to me because there is a need to kind of like reclaim space and add color and add nuance to these landscapes that, once again, I feel like a lot of times are taken for granted. And it's really exciting to me that it's on the ground, like people are actually walking on it. I think it's still there. It's probably pretty faded by this point, but every time I go back, I see more tracks and I see more like bike, kind of like bike lines and stuff. So it feels really, really exciting that that piece is still kind of living on in that way. Okay, and then I want to talk about, so this is 2021, when I went back to the desert. So I was born in New Mexico, and then I moved to France when I was 5, and then came back to the US when I was 18 in 2014. So yes, I went back to the desert for the first time, and I remember feeling like I had never been anywhere that like actually physically looked like me. I remember looking out at these landscapes and seeing all the different shades of brown and gold and red. And even like the juniper, like it feels like it's freckling the landscape. And I just felt this kind of need to start thinking more and more about the materials that I'm using, and going more deeply into this narrative of like, okay, humans and nature, and how is our narrative like more intertwined. So I started just harvesting some soil and just kind of putting it on the canvas. And here you can kind of see the evolution of that piece that I brought. And it feels really, I always love sharing the process because it also feels really important to me as an artist to kind of inspire other people to become artists. And once again, I think there's just like this need for like transparency and inclusion. I love having open studios. That's also what I love about murals, is that people come along the way and they see how you're doing it. It's not just like a magical thing that appears. And so, yeah, so I started just adding soil layer by layer until it became a portrait. And then I came back after that trip and kept going with these portraits. Those are 2 mentors and friends of mine, and I invited them to gather soil from places of power, of importance to them. So on the left, that's Justin Robinson, and he gathered from 7 different places, including ancestral burial grounds, different, I think from the forest, Duke Forest, different homes that he had in his garden, and Michelle Lanier on the right, who did a similar thing, but she had 4 different kinds of soil. And so, yeah, that felt like a turning moment for me when I really, once again, started to think a little bit more deeply about how is the material that we use, how does that actually have a life of itself? And how can I kind of answer this call of taking taking a little bit more time to make each piece, spending more time with the different colors and understanding like their context and understanding, you know, how to harvest them, when to harvest them. So yes, so this was this year. It's really exciting. I taught a class called the Durham Palette, and we met every Saturday for about a month. And all of these different lessons that I was learning, I just wanted to find a community to share them with and to also learn from. And yeah, it was a really sweet time. So I take teaching and community gathering and sharing space very seriously. It feels really important to me to do so, because once again, I feel like it's not enough to just like paint portraits of people that I love, that I really admire. Like it's like actually how can we like share the space together and how can we learn from each other? So yeah, we did this class and it felt for me like a really transformative time. These are some pictures of the class. I brought some of those pigments that are up there. We did like a little booklet kind of explaining to people like how to forage, where to forage. So these two pieces I did when I was in New Orleans for an art residency, and I chose these two pieces because I wanted to talk a little bit more deeply about materials and how I want to use materials and pieces to kind of to inspire people to think differently about time and space. And so basically you have different layers. I'm going to move closer to it. There's 4 different layers in both of these pieces, and each layer actually kind of represents a different time. So these are pieces of dried palmetto, and I wanted to kind of use them as the outer layer to talk about indigenous land stewardship, like thinking about where we are right now and how at a time and place it was stewarded by indigenous people, the particular land that I was on in New Orleans. And then I used soil. Soil was gathered from that same place that was then during colonial times became a plantation. And then I used paper from old books, old academic books, kind of talking about like man and nature, and it was like very like old archaic ways of teaching science with like old grainy black and white pictures and like men in lab coats. And then finally the last layer is just black like charcoal ink, because I think these materials are really unique and can give kind of like a context of where we are and how can we exist outside of colonial times, because that feels really important to me to kind of share in the work that I'm doing of like we are at a time of climate collapse and we are at a time of like rampant white supremacy and like all these anti-LGBTQ laws that are being passed. But there was a time where that wasn't always the case. It's not something that was like permanent. It's not something that's set in stone. And these materials, these plants and the soil has witnessed that. And that's what I feel really excited about, like understanding how different communities on different lands, like how they've actually like altered the chemistry of the soil and how that's altered the color of the soil and also altered the plants that are there. And so I did these two pieces kind of like in similarities. They kind of represent divergent like narratives of where we are. So this is obviously one that's a bit more. It's still very real, but it's very violent. And these little beads, they look like beads, but they're called myrtles, and they're actually like runoff from like fossil fuel plants. And this is a Carolina parakeet that went extinct a while ago, but that used to be all over the Carolinas. And so this is obviously a little bit more of a bleak reality, and this one kind of presents resistance and and the future and hope. And so I used a different. You can't see the frame, but this frame had Spanish moss on it, which was used and is used by indigenous folks for building construction. The soil I gathered was from a maroon community, so where people were able to escape plantation and able to, practice sovereignty. And then the paper was from different, same thing, like journals of strength and liberation, and from people who were organizing and publishing their work. And then finally, same thing, the ink was from a fire that I did around friends. And the turtle is obviously like, I mean, it's not extinct, it's still around, but I really love how it's kind of like looking up, and it's almost like as if it was a helmet, adding protection. Snake root that's on the ear, that was eaten by like maroon folks out in the swamp. It's an edible plant. The spiral is kind of like a symbol for time, once again, that's used in many different indigenous traditions, to represent like kind of like continuity and like non-linearity of time. And then the blossoms in the hair, blackberry, same thing. It's a food, it's sustenance. So that's, so I just wanted to kind of share those so you can understand a little bit like how I think about each piece, how I think about composition. And there's a lot of pairs in what I do, because it's never really just one story and one time. It's always like, they always kind of mirror each other. And so just more pictures of things that I do when I have free time. This is elderberry, and botanical pigments are actually really interesting because every time you're going to go process them, this is something we learned in our class, it's going to be a little bit different, because each berry has a little bit of a different flavor to it, different color to it. How you do the extractive process of getting the color to separate from the water. It's not an exact science. At least for me, it isn't. So you can kind of see that there's two different shades. And for soil, however, it is a little bit different. And I actually wanted to talk a little bit just about the lessons I'm learning from soil and from botanical pigments. So soil, when you paint with soil, it's permanent. The color stays. It's always going to be with you. And we still use like soil pigments today within acrylic, within all kinds of artwork. That color is not going to fade. And then botanicals, as I was showing before, obviously it's a little bit more fluid, and there's also like a light fastness to it. The folks have used natural dyes before. That color, it's not going to keep its vibrancy. It is going to fade over time. And I think that that's really interesting, this idea of permanency and kind of fading. And I was kind of just trying to think about how those lessons or these teachings are applied to ways that like Black folks, like BIPOC queer folks, are embodying freedom. And if I'm thinking about maroon communities, there was a need to disappear. There is a need to, exist outside of the colonial system and fade. And so I don't have any work that I don't have any work that I kind of share these ideas right now. This is just what I've been thinking about. But I would feel really excited about, painting stories of maroon folks with these pigments that are going to fade in time. Because the point is not, once again, it's not permanency, it's not like perfection. So I'm excited about doing that at some point in the future for a future show. And then with soil pigments, what I feel really excited about is that, nature is very queer. Nature has always been very queer. This idea of heteronormativity that is literally killing people all over the world it's very sad and it's very frustrating. So I want to represent stories and paint people in my community, in the queer community, trans folks, with these soil pigments as a way to kind of show that we have always existed here, we have always been here. It's not anything unnatural. And so, and thinking about, thinking about things that kind of root us in place. It feels really exciting that I'm learning these lessons from these materials. Obviously, like where I gather from is very important. Gathering from plantations, gentrifying communities, Black-owned land. That feels really important. But also, once you put it on the page, what is that material telling you, and what are those lessons? How can you apply those lessons to your life? I don't know how much time I have.
I think you have like 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay.
Do you want me to go back to the mic?
Yeah.
Oh, I can go back. I'm sorry.
You can just hold this one if you want.
forgot we were like live streaming too. Yeah, so yeah, I'll share a little bit about this show, Anti-Solo, that happened last year. And I got a residency at Art Space, which is a big gallery downtown. And when you do residencies, the common kind of like conclusion of them is you get a solo show and you show your work, and that's kind of it. But once again, you know, as I'm sure you've gathered by this point, my work is so centered on community, and it is beyond like how are we going to represent these alternate versions. It is really like how are we actually going to practice this right now. And so the solo show was converted into a group show. I invited people of my community in, and we totally transformed the space, which was super exciting, honestly, because that's the other thing of like being an artist that I'm learning as I'm practicing. It can be a very solitary. It can be a very solitary life. Like I'm just in the studio all the time, painting by myself. And that's not the life that I really want. I really want to be around people, and I really want to be changing things. So it felt really awesome to be able to bring folks in. And the show itself was called Anti-Solo. And a lot of these folks were people who are artists, but who had never had the opportunity to have, you know, stuff up, or didn't feel confident, or all of these things. And it just felt awesome to share that space in that way. Yeah, and so kind of on the note of community and celebration, Afro Carolina is another project that I was working on in partnership with the two folks who, Michelle Linney or Justin Robinson, who I did their soil portraits. All three of us are part of this collective called Afro Carolina. And yeah, I did this banner 2 years ago, and it's dyed with indigo. And the symbology comes from okra, and Michelle Lanier is the person who coined the term Afro Carolina, and the symbology, you know, it's kind of came from when you slice open an okra, it looks like that print of slave ships. I'm sure some folks are familiar with this print of how enslaved folks were like lined all next to each other in these big ships, and okra comes from Africa. And still plays, I mean, it plays a huge role within the life of Black folks like across the diaspora today. And so once again, like this is kind of an example of the impact that how plants have we've carried plants with us for such a long time, and their cultural significance. And yeah, and we actually are celebrating Afro Carolina today. That's where I'm going after this talk. If folks want to join, you're welcome to. It'll be a great time. It's at North Star, yeah. And we're going to be doing like live printing, and yeah, folks are going to be bringing like shirts and different things to print on. And there's stuff that's been dyed with indigo and goldenrod, and I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.